So Rob, as I said, is the Elders Livestock Production Coordinator. And we've had Rob before. He's not a stranger here to AWI Extension New South Wales. He joins us over a lot of different platforms throughout our organisation. So it's great to have him back. And he's based out of Wagga today. And yeah, I'll hand the reins over to you, Rob. We're ready to go.
Okay.
I've got your presentation up. That's perfect.
Okay. Am I audible, Fiona?
You sure are.
Okay. Thank you very much. So thank you, Fiona, and good afternoon and welcome everybody. I want to focus on here. So summer sheep nutrition. So for those that are in the non-seasonal rainfall area, I suspect for them, some will be talking about pre-joining management, so how to manage your ewes during joining and during pregnancy. For those that are in a spring lambing situation in the tablelands or further east, we're probably talking about weaner management and post-weaning recovery. So they're the three areas I want to focus on: post-weaning recovery, ewe management for joining, and more importantly, weaner nutrition, because obviously those weaners, whether you're an autumn lammer or a spring lammer, at some stage will be being fed during the summer. I don't seem to be working here, Fiona. I can't get any activity on my screen.
Seem to have managed to enlarge your screen somehow. So if you just click on the screen and use your arrow key on the keyboard, Rob, to go forward.
Yep.
Yep.
Right. Now we're in action. Now we're action. Yep. Okay. So I want to outline what I want to focus on is feed budgeting. As I said, concentrate on ewe weaner management, because everyone during the summer, at some stage during the summer, will be feeding ewe weaners. I want to focus on some ewe recovery for those that are weaning in spring and summer. Ewe recovery is important. And also, if we get summer rain, some areas I know are still green, but many of the areas, including where I'm from in the Riverina, we have had some summer rain, which has sort of ruined our dry feed and brought on this summer green feed, which is a mixed blessing in a lot of cases. So what I want to focus on first is feed quantity. There's a really good site. Many of you may have used it or seen it, the AWI Feed on Offer Library. So there's a whole gallery of different pastures or different feed on offer sites, if you like, that gives you a pretty good handle on how to assess pasture quantity. So as you can see in this photo here, if you want to do it by the book, you can buy yourself a quadrant or make yourself a ring. That ring there is a tenth of a square metre or 112 centimetres in circumference, and go across the paddock a dozen to 15 times with a pair of cutters and actually weigh the pasture in that tenth of a square metre ring. Or once you've got your eye in, you can just use height and density and make a pretty good assumption of how much feed on offer is in that paddock. Alternatively, as I said, you can go to the Feed on Offer library on the AWI website, and it gives you a pretty good a good gallery of examples, and you should be able to find a pasture that sort of lines up with what you're looking at. So in this pasture here, you can see we've got 200 kilos of green material, which is more digestible. 1,500 kilos per hectare of dead material for a total of 1,700 kilos per hectare. Now, bear in mind, this is all done on a dry matter basis. So when we cut that green material, we need to adjust for dry matter, which is a skill that you will learn as you do more of this stuff. The three figures to really focus on are the dry matter digestibility, which you can see there, the third line, digestibility percentage. So in this case, 80% of the green material is digestible, 57% of the dead, for an average of 60%, roughly. Now, what that means is 60% of that feed on offer will be used for maintenance or growth, or wool growth, or growth of meat or milk if they're lactating. So in other words, 40% of that material is basically in one end and out the other. So that digestibility figure is a really important figure. We need to focus on that because it has a profound effect on intake, and obviously a profound effect on energy and protein consumption. The metabolizable energy, you can see on the fourth line, is a measurement of the number of megajoules per kilogram of dry matter. So a megajoule is just a measurement of heat. So it's measuring basically how much energy is in each kilogram of that feed. Crude protein also is significant, particularly when we're talking about feeding weaners. So as I said, there's a full gallery of different pastures, and you should be able to find something that's fairly similar to what you're looking at in the paddock. Here, if you're lucky enough to have had spring rain, or you've got a bit of a summer break, you might have a nice stand of lucerne, something similar to that. So again, we can see there's much more feed on offer there. There's nearly 6 tons of feed on offer. High digestibility, as one would expect with a legume, and also obviously higher in crude protein. So they're the 3 figures again that we look at: digestibility, metabolizable energy, and crude protein. When we're we need those figures when we're designing a feed ration, particularly for our weaners. So while quantity is important, the feed quality is also very important. And as we focused on before, talking about the digestibility, which is a measurement of the quality of the feed. And as you can see here, as feed matures in its vegetative stage, it is highly digestible. So most of the material they eat is actually being turned into use for maintenance or wool growth or milk production, if they're lactating. As plants mature, the soluble carbohydrates that are being produced during photosynthesis start getting converted into structural carbohydrates or cell wall, if you like. So the taller those plants grow, the thicker the cell wall, the more of that sugar that's in the plant gets converted into cell wall and structural carbohydrate, which enables the plant to grow tall and spread its seed as evolution intended. Unfortunately, from a livestock production point of view, the taller that grass, the less digestible it is. So as you can see there, as it turns to seed and then dies off, the nutritive value of that material, of that feed, becomes less, drops, as dry matter digestibility drops. So at the moment, if you're lucky enough not to have had your dry feed ruined by summer rain, we're sitting at about here in southern New South Wales. So our annual species have dried off. They've senesced. But where areas that haven't had rain, some of those soluble carbohydrates are still in the feed, maintaining quite reasonably good quality. So certainly enough to maintain a dry sheet. Unfortunately, some areas that have had rain in the past few weeks, a lot of those soluble carbohydrates will have been washed out, which means the dry matter digestibility has dropped. Ergo, the quality of the feed has dropped. So we're now basically below maintenance. So where there's been summer rain on that dry feed, as I said, the carbohydrates have been washed out, and we're probably seeing ewes going backwards on that dry feed. Alternatively, if you're lucky enough to have some summer active pastures like lucerne, or you've got some brassica, grazing brassica or something, the rain would have, you've obviously would have had response to the rain, and that new green pick, that fresh green pick, is obviously highly digestible. However, there are a few caveats to that, so which we'll discuss shortly. So some of that fresh green pick, while it is highly digestible, there are some pitfalls to that, to some of that feed. So for those that take this seriously, I suppose it is really good to get a feed test done from time to time. We run a few weaners for profit groups, or winning with weaners groups, where we're helping people manage their weaners. And in doing so, we're taking regular feed tests. So this was a feed test from about 6 weeks ago, back in late September, early October. It was done in the Riverina. So you can see there, the figures to focus on are the dry matter. So that's a measurement of how much water's in the feed. And as I said before, when we're calculating the amount of feed in the paddock, we need to account for water, the amount of water that's in the feed, because obviously water, there's no energy or protein in water. So we need to make an adjustment for water. The next figure is the neutral detergent fibre. Now, the neutral detergent fibre is a measurement of the amount of material that passes through the rumen of the animal undigested. So basically what the animal eats, so what it's telling us is 60% of what that, or roughly 60% in both those cases, of what that animal eats is passing through the rumen undigested. Now that figure has a profound effect on intake. So obviously the higher the neutral detergent fibre, the more fibrous the feed, the slower the rate of passage, so it takes longer for that feed or for that material to move through the rumen and the rest of the digestive tract, and it reduces their daily intake. So the higher that NDF number, the lower the daily intake of the feed. The acid detergent fibre is the next figure. So acid detergent fibre is a measurement of the cellulose and the lignin, which I spoke about before. So basically, the older the plant and the taller the plant, the more that carbohydrate has been converted to structural carbohydrates, such as cellulose and lignin, which is cell walls for all intents and purposes. The higher that number, obviously that has an effect on the digestibility. The lower the digestibility of the plant, the less energy the animal can extract from it. Crude protein is a measurement of the nitrogen in the feed. And as we'll see shortly, it's not always a good indicator of the amount of protein that the animal can extract from the feed, because some of that nitrogen is also held or bound up in some of that neutral detergent and acid detergent fibre. So whilst it measures the amount of nitrogen, it's not always a true indicator of the amount of protein that the animal can get from the feed. In this case, though, at 12.3 and 10.2%, one would assume that there's sufficient protein in that feed to maintain a dry sheep, or indeed, put a little bit of weight on a ewe trying to recover. The next figure, as we spoke of before, is the dry organic matter digestibility, which is basically a proxy for the quality of the feed. So that's indicative of the quality. In this case, nearly 60%. We know that feed is digestible enough to at least maintain a dry ewe and possibly put a little bit of condition on a ewe that's trying to recover. Is it good enough for a weaner? It would be marginal at best, but I would say, in my experience, that would not be good enough to feed a weaner that we're trying to grow at 100 grams a day, and I'll demonstrate that shortly. Again, the metabolizable energy in the feed is a measurement of the amount of energy per kilogram of dry matter, and that has obviously an effect because when we work out the amount of feed they can eat per day, so if a sheep can eat 1 kilogram of that particular feed per day, we multiply that by the energy per kilogram, and we know that if a sheep's eating a kilogram of that feed, they're getting 8.9 and 8.6 megajoules of energy per day consecutively. Is that enough to maintain a dry sheep? Well, depending on the frame, the condition or the standard reference weight and the skin on the sheep, yes, in some cases it would, in other cases perhaps just falling short. The water-soluble carbohydrate, as I mentioned before, is a measurement of as the name suggests, is the amount of sugar in the feed. So whilst the feed's dry and without rain on it, the feed maintains, or the grass maintains, that water-soluble carbohydrate, and that's why we see sheep do quite well in early summer before we see the summer rain. So the dry feed is quite high quality. Unfortunately, if we get a rainfall event like we had down here the other day, a lot of that sugar has been washed out and will render that feed much less digestible, or much lower quality. So you can see, basically, in summary, the higher the digestibility, the higher the energy yield. It's pretty much a linear relationship. So as digestibility drops, and incidentally, once the feed has senesced, then as a rule of thumb, digestibility falls by about 1% per week. So if at the moment, without rain, our feed's at roughly 60% dry matter digestibility, we'll lose about 1% per week over the next 3 months. So by the end of February, even without rain, that digestibility and the quality of that feed will be well below 50%, which is why we need to start supplementary feeding, obviously. So this is where we're sitting at the moment, at about 60% dry matter digestibility, which you can see is yielding, as the feed test suggests, about 9 megajoules of energy per day. Now, I want to focus on weaner management, because I think no matter where you live, at some stage during the summer, you will be feeding your weaners. And weaner management, I believe, is something, that I believe as an industry we don't do particularly well, particularly given the capricious seasons or capricious summers that we're having. As I said, the rainfall is ruining a lot of our dry feed, and and in many cases, we've had these prolific late springs, so massive quantities of feed, but the quality of the feed has been very low, and I think some of the weaners have been suffering as a result. So what piqued my interest was this slide. Many of you may have seen it if you've been to a Winning with Weaners workshop, but this was work that was done at Trangie. So the numbers to focus on, so these were ewe weaners that were weighed at 9 months of age, which coincidentally is about the start of puberty for merino sheep. So you can see the average or the median weight of these two flocks was 28.8 and 27.4 kilograms respectively. Then the bottom quartile were 28.4 and 26.9. The top quartile were 30.1 and 28.4. respectively. Not a great range, only a kilo, basically half a kilo difference between the lightest and the median, and about a 2 kilo spread between the lightest and the heaviest. But look at the difference it made in their reproductive performance over the next 5 years. So in flock C, that bottom quartile, the lighter ewes only raised 1.6 lambs for the rest of their life, whereas the top quartile raised 5.6. And again, with flock D, only 1 lamb for the rest of their life as opposed to 4.8. So that weight at 9 months, that weight at the start of puberty, had a really profound effect on their reproductive performance for the rest of their lives. So that's what piqued my interest and has got me sort of starting up some of these, or us, a group of us at Elders starting up some of these weeder management groups to try and guide people through the management. So this is one example of a producer. You can see here, he weaned at 12 weeks of age. So this, in the area that this fellow was in, it was quite tough. The ewes had lost quite a bit of condition during lactation. So the decision was made to wean a bit earlier. He joins over 5 weeks. So the youngest of these lambs were 5 weeks old. The oldest was 7 weeks. The oldest were 12 weeks old, rather. The youngest were 7 weeks old. Yeah, so you can see we weighed them at weaning. They were a little bit, we plotted a line first of all. So based on their standard reference weight, we plotted a line just to see a weight for age curve, we call it. So where they should sit at various periods during their life. And we wanted, the idea is being to try and keep their actual weight as close to that line as possible. Because as soon as we fall off that line, it takes a lot of feed to try and get back on it. So the closer we stay to that line, the easier it is to manage those sheep. And our goal here is to make sure that they're at least on or above that line at 40 weeks of age or 9 months. This was the middleweight weaners. So we drafted 3 ways. The heavies just went on to pasture because they were, sort of, nearly 30 kilos, some of them. The mediums were weighing about, as I said, roughly 18 kilos, and then a group of light ones are treated again separately. So you can see here the growth requirement already, because we were below that line, the growth requirement to get to week 24, which was our last weighing last week, was 150 grams per day. So what did we need to do to achieve that 150 grams per day? I'll show you in a sec what pasture they were on and how we made our calculations. But basically, our calculations came up with this, that we needed to feed 375 grams per head per day of faba beans, plus or as a supplement on the pasture that they were on to achieve that growth rate, to hit that blue line. As you can see, we actually overdid it a bit. We're slightly above the line, so we did overcook them a bit, but better that way than the other way. So how do we make these calculations? We use the Winning with Weaners material. If those have been to a workshop, will know what I'm talking about here. So firstly, we worked out that we called them a 25 kilogram weaner. So we split the difference between 18 kilograms where they are and that their finishing weight at about 28 kilos, and assumed that we're feeding a 25 kilo weaner. So to grow at 150 grams per head per day, we know that we needed a 12 megajoule diet, which using faba beans, we know that faba beans are roughly 12 megajoules on an as-fed basis. So using that, we knew that we needed to feed 950 grams per head per day at 13% crude protein. Now, as I said, we didn't need to feed that much because they were going on to pasture, but we used this in order to make our calculations. Another figure just to keep in mind for later on is the amount of energy required to grow at 50 grams per day for that 30 kilogram weaner. So a bit later on, you can see there, we need 880 grams of a 10 megajoule density at 10% crude protein. So just bear that in mind for later on. So this was the pasture that they were going on. As you can see, this was back in mid-September. Early to mid-September, the barley grass was already starting to run up to head, so he decided he was going to crash this paddock pretty hard. As you can see, plenty of quantity there, pretty good legume content. That's the feed test from that pasture. So at 43% neutral detergent fibre, we knew that the intake wasn't going to be stifled. They will be able to eat roughly 3% of their body weight. Crude protein is certainly sufficient at 21.1%. And the ME, albeit a little bit lower than we'd like, was still adequate. So we used that feed test, used those numbers then to calculate how many faba beans we needed to feed. And the calculations went thus. So in terms of energy, we knew that the pasture, we worked out their requirements first based on the Winning with Weaners chart, and we knew that we needed 12 megajoules energy density in the feed. We need to feed 950 grams of that 12 megajoule diet to give us our 11.5 megajoules, which is the amount of energy we need to achieve that 150 grams per head per day of growth. So we assumed the weaners were getting about 7 megajoules from the pasture. And how we worked that out, we assumed they were eating about 3% of their body weight. 3% of a body weight of a 25 kilogram weaner is 750 grams by 9.6 megajoules, I think it was, came out at about 7 megajoules, or 7.2 megajoules. So we knew that there was a 4.5 megajoule shortfall. Because he was feeding faba beans, we calculated that faba beans on an as-fed basis are 12 megajoules of energy per kilo. You might argue that they could be a little bit higher than that, but again, we were sort of budgeting cautiously or conservatively. So at 4.5 megajoules requirement over 12 megs gave us a calculation, or gave us a quantity of 370 grams per day as fed, or 4.5 megajoules. Now, as well as energy, we need to, because these weaners are growing, and any animal that's growing, be it a weaner or a ewe trying to recover weight, or a ram producing sperm, or a ewe producing or growing a fetus, we need to make sure that we're covering the protein requirements. So just to check, we checked that they were getting enough protein. So at 950 grams by 13%, assuming faba beans is 123, 13% is 123 grams per day. The pasture we knew is providing 720 grams by 21% crude protein, which is from the feed test. Now, as I said before, not all that protein is available to the animal, because that crude protein is a measure of nitrogen, not necessarily of metabolizable protein. So we use a conversion factor of 0.5, which is the amount of that protein, crude protein, that we know is going to be metabolized in the rumen. So from the pasture, we were getting 75 grams a day. From the 375 grams of faba beans, we know that faba beans on average is about 23% crude protein. Again, we use a conversion factor of 0.6, because not all of that nitrogen is, or that crude protein is available as microbial or metabolizable protein. So using that calculation, they're getting 52 grams from the faba beans, plus the 75 grams from the pasture is 175 grams per day. So we knew that we were fulfilling their protein requirement as well as their energy requirement. And the other good thing about faba beans, or any pulse crop for that matter, be it lupins, peas, chickpeas, whatever, we know that some of that protein is, the good quality protein is not degraded in the rumen. It's called undegradable rumen protein, which accounts for about 40% of the total protein. So another 34 grams was available as undegraded protein, which obviously helps that growing weaner. Now, going back to our first slide in this section on weight at puberty, we know that skeletal growth doubles during puberty, and that's the case for any mammal, humans included. So we need to make sure, again, going back to that graph at 9 months of age, that we're giving the animals or these weaners enough nutrition to support good skeletal growth. So bone is 30% protein or 30% collagen. Collagen is a protein. So 30% of the bone, the actual matrix that makes up the foundation of the bone is collagen. So obviously the more collagen we have, the more framework we have, the more minerals we can stack on that framework. And it's the minerals, particularly calcium and phosphorus, or particularly calcium, which is the repository. Basically, the skeleton, as we all know, is the repository for calcium. So later on in life, when that ewe needs to draw down calcium, that calcium will come from the bone. So I guess what I'm saying is the more collagen we produce, the more calcium we can stack on that bone, the bigger the frame, the better the repository, the more calcium that you can draw on later on when she's building or growing a fetus or lactating. And we can circle back and see that weight at puberty is clearly, a lot of that weight at puberty is in that bone. And we had this proved in a couple of lifetime ewe sessions where, and I'm sure people would have observed it on their own properties, where certain age groups don't appear to perform as well as other age groups. And if you were to weigh those sheep, a sheep in the same condition score, on the same nutrition, you would find that those sheep that had a better weaning, a better life as a weaner, will be heavier, and that is bone and muscle. So the key point here is collagen is a protein. If those weaners become protein deficient or energy deficient, which is not producing enough microbial protein, then we'll compromise collagen production, we'll compromise skeletal growth, will compromise the frame of the animal, and obviously its ability to get pregnant in the first place, and secondly to wean a lamb later on. Don't forget the minerals, as well as growing that collagen matrix. We need to make sure that we're supplying plenty of calcium and phosphorus, particularly, along with a whole lot of other minerals, to make sure that mineral component of the bone is being grown. As I said, if you ever wonder why some drops perform better than worse, and in all the lifetime ewe groups or winning with weaner groups that we've run as a company, we have noticed that certain age groups certainly perform better than others. And if you go back and look at the history of those animals, it nearly always aligns with a poor setback during weaning, if you like, a period of poor growth during weaning, and particularly during puberty. As I said, don't forget the minerals. Now, I don't want to confound people too much, but in order to make a good diet for a weaner, you should probably speak to a nutritionist about this. But this is a thing called a Pearson square. Quite simple to do, quite simple to draw up, but any good nutritionist should be able to help you with this. So basically what I've done here is we've set a target. We want to make sure that these weaners, their ration is at least 15% crude protein. So we take the ingredients and we can sort of mix and match, if you like, make sure that our final ration is hitting 15% crude protein. And you can see in the box below the proportions of that ration. So in this case, it was barley, faba beans, and a bit of roughage. The proportions of that ration that are required in order to meet that protein target. And also checking over on the left-hand side there, making sure that our ration is energy dense enough. Remember I said before, we need to make sure our ration is at least 11 megajoules of energy per kilogram, because they've only got a small rumen, they can't fit much in. That ration needs to be really dense in energy and high in protein in order for those sheep to perform. So as I said, any good nutritionist should be able to do this for you. And that ration there, which is a total ration, bear in mind that it's assuming there was no pasture, was about 40 cents a day. In the case of the producer I just showed you, where at least about 70% of their nutrition was coming from the pasture, his feed cost was about 15 cents per head per day. And again, with any grain ration, you need to make sure that you provide good buffering. We don't want the animals getting acid or suffering from acidosis, or we don't want that rumen pH fluctuating too wildly. Because if the rumen pH fluctuates wildly, it has a severe effect on feed utilization or feed efficiency, and also can make them very sick, obviously. And also we need to make sure we take care of the minerals, and weaners need pristine water. If possible, have them on troughs, not dams. And also, if possible, make sure you're cleaning those troughs, particularly during the summer, cleaning them daily. If at the very least, cleaning them at least a couple of times a week, because they do require good water is a really important nutrient for young stock. And here's the weaners in question. So as you can see, this is the middle age or the middle weight group, tucking into their Faber beans. That's a system that I like to use or like to recommend. Just some C-sections, some roof purlin, 150 mil roof purlin, tech screwed to some tires to keep it off the ground. It stops them standing in it, but it keeps the feed clean and obviously a lot less wasteful. Plenty of trough space there. There's at least 0.5 metre of trough space per head. Now we'll touch on ewe recovery. So again, as I said, particularly for spring lambers, we'll have ewes that, depending on your season, will have lost considerable condition. And the sooner we get that condition back on while the pasture allows, or while a good quality pasture is available, the cheaper it'll be to get condition on those ewes. So my philosophy is everything you do after lamb marking will be having an effect on next year's lamb drop. So if you leave those lambs on too long and milk too much condition off your ewes, you will start to compromise next year's fertility rate. So as we all know, everyone should have seen this. It's from Lifetime Ewe again. The condition score at joining, there's a linear relationship between the condition score at joining and the number of fetuses conceived. So you can see there, it's pretty much that black line is the average, a straight line relationship. The better the condition score at joining, the more fetuses will be conceived. And you can see the blue line, we obviously get less singles as the number of twins increase, the green line, and clearly the number of empty ewes at scanning decreases as condition score increases. So pretty much linear relationship. The better condition they are at joining, not only will they conceive more lambs, they'll also wean more lambs, because we know that their condition score at joining also has an effect on their ability to milk and also the birth size or the birth weight of the lamb at lambing. So a lot of those fundamental things, birth weight, lactation, are all set up in that either pre-joining period or certainly during while the rams are in. So the better the condition, the better they're managed prior to joining, and during that first 4 weeks of joining, the more lambs will mark next year. And we also know that ewes will lose at least, particularly depending on litter size, but they'll lose a full condition score during lactation, even on good feed. If a ewe carrying twin lambs, even on really good quality feed, we know that she's going to lose a full condition score during lactation. And that ability to twin is highly repeatable. So if we give those ewes a chance and get them back in condition, we know that they'll keep performing and keep doing all the heavy lifting for our business. And obviously, the more condition we milk off those ewes, the higher the quality of the diet we'll need to get condition back on them. So if we let them get down to condition score 2, we're going to need a diet that's 11 megajoules of energy and contains 150 and gives them 115 grams of crude protein a day. So what I'm saying here is that the longer we leave it and the more condition we take off those ewes, the bigger the hurdle in front of us in terms of getting condition back on those ewes prior to joining. So as you can see here again from Lifetime Ewe or Best Wool, Best Lamb, the key message I want to focus on here is the amount of energy, the energy deficit that's required to lose half a condition score. You can see here, if using 4.5 megs of deficit, which will certainly happen during lactation. In terms of twins, it's more likely to be 10 megs of deficit. We know that they'll lose half a condition score. However, to get that half a condition score back on, we need to feed 9 megajoules of surplus energy. So in other words, we need twice as much energy to put the condition back on as the energy that we are in deficit to lose it. So again, the longer we leave it and the more condition we pull off those ewes, the bigger the hurdle is, or the bigger the mountain becomes to get condition back on them. So the key take-home message in this is feed early and feed less. The sooner you start to recognise that they're losing condition, And the sooner you start to enact a feeding program, the less feed you'll use, and obviously the less it will cost you to get the condition back on those ewes. So let's look at a couple of examples. Here's a pasture again from this property in mid-September. So because he weaned early, he was able to get his ewes back onto some reasonably good quality pasture. So on this pasture here, it's 70% dry matter digestibility. We know that a weaner can eat about 3.3% of his body weight in intake, as we said before. So a 30 kilogram weaner now at 3.3%, he's eating about a kilogram a day. By 10 megajoules means he's getting 10, or he or she getting 10 megajoules per day at about 12 to 15% crude protein. And if you remember back from that winning with weaners chart, that was the requirement to grow at about, well, it was less than that to grow at 50 grams a day. But if we extrapolate those numbers, that pasture is providing enough energy and protein to grow a weaner at about 70 grams per day. A 60 kilogram ewe, trying to put condition back on our ewes prior to joining, can eat 3% of her body weight at 10 megajoules, means she's getting 18 megs a day of daily energy intake, again at 12 to 15% crude protein. How much condition will a 60 kilogram ewe gain? Well, we know that a maintenance requirement for a 60 kilogram ewe is about 9.6 megajoules. If you remember the chart before, we needed 9 megajoules of surplus to put on half a condition score. So on that pasture, we're bang on target. In a month's time, assuming the quality remains the same, we would regain that half a condition score that we needed to put back on. However, different pasture, I will concede, but same principle. By October, you can see the dry matter digestibility has dropped 10%, but it's had a significant effect on intake. We're down to 2% of our body weight now in terms of intake. So that 35 kilogram weaner that's obviously grew through September can now only eat 0.7 of a kilogram. That pasture has declined in quality. If you remember from the first slide, that pasture was about 8.6 megajoules of energy, which means their daily energy intake is going to be 6 megs at 6 to 8% crude protein. Is this going to maintain our growth rate of 70 grams per day? No way. Both in terms of energy and protein, it is well short. Our 60 kilogram ewe that we're trying to get condition back on before joining is now only able to eat 1.2 kilograms of that pasture on a dry matter basis, meaning a daily intake of 10.3 megajoules. As I said before, maintenance requirement for a 60 kilogram ewe is 9.6, so she's only just above maintenance. She may be putting on 20 or 30 grams a day, but she's certainly not going to regain that half a condition score that we need her to put back on before joining. If we were required to supplementary feed to meet the requirements, we'd be already up to 500 grams a day of lupins or faba beans for our weaners, and about 800 grams a day for our mature ewes, in order to put that condition score on, or that condition on that we need to regain prior to joining. Again, don't forget minerals. Now, depending what part of the world you're in and what your soil type is and what your feed type is, that will vary greatly. Whether it's dry feed or green feed, whether you're a grass or a legume dominant pasture, or whether it's an annual or perennial, will have a bearing on the requirements. The main ones we need to, particularly if you're feeding cereal grain, we know cereal grain is very high in phosphorus. So whenever we're feeding cereal grains, or cereal hay for that matter, we need to make sure that we're providing a calcium supplement to keep that calcium phosphorus balance in check. Also, because we're trying to grow wool, we need to make sure that we're supplying a bit of sulfur, a bit of supplementary sulfur, because sulfur is implicit in keratin production. Keratin is the protein that makes up wool, skin, hooves, etc., etc. So, and we have seen some issues, particularly after the run of wet years, where a lot of the sulfur has been leached out of the soil, and because we're not applying as much single super as we used to 20 or 30 years ago, our sulfur levels have dropped, and we're starting to see that manifest itself in some wool issues, with either poor wool growth or wool problems, and also foot and skin afflictions. Trace minerals we need to take care of too, and again, that it depends, it's location dependent, but certainly cobalt, iodine is orally supplemented, as the macro minerals I was speaking of before, but things like manganese, zinc, copper and selenium, depending on where you are, are better off given via injection, because we do have, particularly if you're on bore water or if you have pastures that are high in potassium, we do have some complicating or some antagonistic effects when it comes to the absorption of those micro minerals when we try and give them orally. Whether you use blocks, loose licks is certainly our preference. That's probably the bee's knees, that bottom photo with a covered loose lick dispenser. But I appreciate that in some situations, loose licks aren't convenient. So if that's the case, then blocks are certainly better than nothing. And make sure, I guess, you buy the block that suits the situation. Summer rain, yes, as I said, some of our areas, particularly in the southeast of the Riverina, have had a significant summer rain event, and it looks like there might be more on the way. If you happen to have lucerne or some grazing crops, happy days. But if we start to see some regrowth, unfortunately, a lot of that regrowth, particularly on stubbles, is very high in nitrogen and very low in carbohydrate. So what we'll invariably see is when we put sheep onto these pastures, we'll see some at least subclinical or acute nitrate poisoning, worst case scenario, which will kill them. Best case scenario, we'll see some weight loss and certainly see some scouring from that, basically that nitrate overload. A lot of these grasses or this new fresh growth is also very low in magnesium. And as I said, we will probably cause a protein overload if we don't balance that excess protein with some energy. The other thing is obviously toxic weeds, things like St. John's wort and hairy panic in our part of the world will cause issues, photosensitization and some kidney problems as well. And the main issue really with this summer, fresh summer grass, is it is initially in its vegetative phase, very low in carbohydrate, very high in protein, throws the rumen out of balance and puts pressure on the liver of the sheep particularly. For further learning, I can highly recommend the Lifetime U course. I've run about 40 groups, I reckon, and certainly we at Elders will probably run north of 50 groups, I suspect. So really good course, hands-on, obviously, puts all of this stuff that I've been talking about into practical terms. The other one is the Winning with Weeders webinar, which I highly recommend. And if you are interested, if you'd like to sort of take that on in a practical sense, then I'm sure there'll be people. We've certainly got people in our business that would be happy to help you with managing your weaners. And that is it from me. Thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you very much, everybody, for your patience. I hope you got something out of it.
Thanks, Rob. Great presentation. Lots of information in there for everyone from across the state. The Q&A panel is now open for questions, and we have time left on the board for a couple of questions coming through. So now's your chance to ask Rob anything you need to know to help your planning going forward this season of those weaners as well as ewes. So we have a couple of questions that are already in, Rob. The first one is, do you recommend doing pasture analysis testing? And if so, how often would you recommend sending it away?
Yes, I do, Fiona. How often? Is basically whenever the pasture changes. So if it's in its vegetative phase, I'd get it tested. Then we go in once we go into reproductive phase. So once the pasture starts to tiller and starts to go what we call go reproductive, so basically it starts making a head or making a flower, that's another good time to test, because that's probably when the pasture's at its absolute peak digestibility. Then if you get a rainfall event like we've just had, that would be another good time to do a test, because we know that the rain will wash a lot of the goodness out of the feed. Whilst it's useful roughage, if we want to, as I said before, maintain sheep or put weight on sheep, we need to have a baseline. So we need to know what the pasture is providing. So we don't want to be going wasting supplementary feed unnecessarily, or B, we don't want to be feeding less than they require and have them losing weight, which will take twice as much feed to get back again. So after a rainfall event or at the start of after weaning, when you're trying to get weight back on ewes, that would be another good time to do a pasture test.
Thanks, Rob. What's the relationship or correlation between NDF and digestibility, given that both factors affect the rate of passage through the digestive system and hence subsequent feed intake levels?
Yeah. So basically NDF, as I said, affects rate of passage. It just determines how much they can eat per day. So if we've got a feed, as I said before, that's, let's say, 10 megajoules of our 10 megajoules per kilogram of dry matter, if the NDF of that pasture, let's make it simple, is 60%, then we know that at 60%, they'll eat about 2% of their body weight in pasture. So a 60 kilogram ewe eating 2% of her body weight will eat 1.2 kilograms at 10 megajoules of energy is 12 megajoules of energy per day. So the NDF determines how much she can eat per day. Obviously, the amount of energy per kilogram determines how much energy they will get per day. Does that, I hope that explains it? So the two are directly correlated. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Sudden increases in protein, Rob, for the weaners, does this have any effect on the quality of the wool?
It can, Fiona, but there is protein and there is protein. So what we call good quality protein that's supplied through pulse grains, particularly like lupins, chickpeas, and faba beans. A lot of that protein is bypass protein, so it doesn't get digested in the rumen. It won't get digested until it gets into the small intestine. That's perfectly safe. What is not so safe is what we call non-protein nitrogen. So lucerne hay, for instance, if it was cut very early, we've seen issues with canola hay that might have been lathered with urea during its growth stage, and if it's been frost affected or drought affected, there'll be high levels of nitrate or nitrite in the plant. Those sorts of protein they can poison the sheep, cause nitrate poisoning, but can certainly affect wool quality by basically making them so sick that there'll be a wool break, or it'll affect the tensile strength. So not all proteins are equal. There's good quality protein that we see in pulse grains, or cottonseed meal, canola meal, or good meals, and there's what we call non-protein or highly rumen degradable protein, which will cause a sudden spike in ammonia levels in the rumen, which can make the animal quite sick and certainly would affect wool quality.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. Following on a protein question 2, when calculating protein, where did you get the conversion factor for pasture and faba beans to account for protein that is tied up in the structural carbohydrate?
Yeah, they're just constants that we work on. That's I don't know when they were established many years ago, but basically, with the pulse grain, about 60% of the protein is rumen degradable. With a pasture, depending on the as I said, on the maturity of the pasture. So if it's in the early vegetative phase, we know that most of that protein is rumen degradable. In the later phase, in the later reproductive phase, we know that about only half that nitrogen or crude protein is rumen degradable. So there'll be umpteen websites you can look that up on, but basically it's a function of how much of that protein or that nitrogen, because crude protein is just a measurement of the nitrogen in the feed. As I said, in a vegetative stage, most of that nitrogen is in a nitrate form, which is instantly volatilized or degraded, digested in the rumen. In mature feed, a lot of that protein is in what we call true protein form, which some of that can be tied up in cellulose, in structural cells or structural carbohydrates. In pulse grain, it is all true protein, some of which gets degraded in the rumen, some of which doesn't get degraded until it reaches the small intestine. So, yeah, there's no clear answer, I suppose. It's based on the type of feed and the maturity of the feed.
Great, thanks, Rob. Final question. In drought conditions, would you recommend feeding weaners in a paddock or in a containment?
It's a very good question. I would recommend feeding them, firstly drafting them by weight. So what we generally see with any drop of weaners, there'll be at least a 20 kilograms spread in weights, and that's even over a 5 or 6 week lambing. if you want to take the two extremes, you know, the firstborn out of a mature ewe could be 30 kilograms. The last born could be a twin out of a maiden ewe, could be 10 kilograms. So you can't run those in the same mob. So first thing, you draft them separately. The heaviest ones potentially could go to a paddock. Those smaller, particularly sub 20 kilo weaners, must be kept in containment. You can't really paddock them out because their rumens just aren't sufficiently developed enough to survive on grass. They need high quality supplement, something like a lupin or a Faber bean. So yes and no. I certainly prefer containment feeding, but if you're stuck for room, maybe the older, the heavier weaners will go out in the paddock. You need to concentrate on the lighter ones. And bear in mind, often those lighter weaners, as I said, are the twins out of maiden ewes. They could be your best, genetically the best sheep on the station, and often they're the ones that die because they're mismanaged. And the other thing is, I thought a very good point that was brought up by someone is when your classer comes to class your ewes, you want him to be classing on genetics, not on your management. So if you split those weaners up and manage them according to their size and their nutritional requirements, then when your classer comes, they should all be the same size. He's not classing your management, he's classing on genetics.
That's a good saying, Rob, whoever you stole that from.
Yeah. I should claim it, but I can't. Yeah.
That brings us to the end of the presentation. So thanks very much, Rob. It's been wonderful to have you back on. And it also brings us to the end of our season in 2024. It's our final webinar. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this year at AWI Extension New South Wales. And we look forward to 2025 and bringing you more fabulous presenters and lots of great information for your businesses. So thank you, everyone. And that's all for us now this year. Bye for now.